BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. On Wednesdays this year, I've been talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, and in this episode, I will be discussing the book Unsolved Murders, the Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper by Patrick Auerbach. Now, to those of you who have followed Zodiac Monday, I did a response to the sections in the book about the Zodiac Killer for that episode, and in this episode on Ripper Wednesday, I will be responding to the chapters about Jack the Ripper. And I must say that I was definitely more impressed with the Jack the Ripper material than the Zodiac material in this book, Unsolved Murders by Patrick Auerbach, because in the Jack the Ripper sections, there are walkthroughs with all of the crime scenes. For example, it starts with an introductory segment about who was Jack the Ripper, then it goes into London and poverty in 1888 when Jack the Ripper was operating, which are some very important things that get intertwined into the Ripper mystery. Then the stories of the possible victims like Emma Smith and Martha Tabram. Then all of the confirmed Ripper victims have a chapter dedicated to them, one about Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly. They all have their own sections in the book. For the Zodiac Killer sections, none of that stuff was present. There were no walkthroughs of the crime scenes, no walkthroughs of the victim stories, and of course, no concluding segment, because at the end of this book there is a Jack the Ripper conclusion. The primary focus of Patrick Auerbach's book is to discuss the suspects in both the Zodiac Killer mystery and the Jack the Ripper case, but with the Zodiac section there was not a concluding paragraph, whereas with Jack the Ripper there was. And I will definitely share with you all of my observations about the book, but I would first like to drop a couple of announcements and let you guys know that there will be a new episode about D.B. Cooper coming out on Fridays. I used to do the Anything Goes Friday segment where any subject was fair game, but right now I'm going to be concentrating on D.B. Cooper. And I also want to let you know that there are 2 chapters now out in the book White Horse Strong. That is a YouTube exclusive that comes out on the weekends. It's part of the White Horse Killer saga. The first was Killer on a White Horse, then the Barry Albert tapes, and now the 3rd book is coming out, White Horse Strong, and that comes out on the weekends. And of course, YouTube shorts, reels come out on both, not only on YouTube, but also on Facebook and Instagram, and I'm going to get back to those in a second and try to release those as frequently as I can, aiming for daily segments. So if you would like to follow along with all of these true crime discussions, and if you're curious about the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, and D.B. Cooper, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And you can also go over to BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxOnlineRadio allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. But I told you that the heart and soul of Patrick Auerbach's book is talking about the different suspect profiles, and I would like to just go through some of his observations and respond to them, because one of the suspects that he devotes a rather big section to is an individual named Aaron Kosminsky. Aaron Kosminsky might even be referred to as the prime suspect in the Jack the Ripper case. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who operated in England in 1888. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery, and of course I've listed off 2 of the possible victims and the 5 confirmed victims. Aaron Kosminsky is an individual that a lot of people think was Jack the Ripper, and even though I haven't endorsed any particular Ripper suspect, when I did the suspect profiles episode, I put Aaron Kosminsky in the upper echelon of suspects, along with other people such as Charles Lechmere, Joseph Barnett, and I added a 4th individual, Jacob Levy. Those are the people that I think were very strong suspects, but there's something that needs to be said for that, because this isn't just some type of like Rubik's Cube that can't be solved where you can just shift everything into a pattern that fits somebody's personal desires. This was a real murder mystery. This is a real murder mystery, and even though I'm not completely convinced that Aaron Kosminsky was Jack the Ripper, I think that there's a very high chance that he was. To provide a little bit of an introduction, let's go to Patrick Auerbach's book in his Aaron Kosminsky chapter. Aaron Kosminsky was born in 1865 and passed away in 1919. He was also known as Aaron Mordka Kosminsky, a Polish hairdresser who emigrated to England in 1880 and worked in the Whitechapel area of London, where the Jack the Ripper murders occurred in 1888. He became a suspect in the case and was institutionalized in 1891 after threatening his sister with a knife. He was initially held at Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum and later transferred to Livingston Asylum. Alright, so that's the basic info about Aaron Kosminsky. One additional piece of information that I recall from when I did the suspect profile episode on him is that Aaron Kosminsky was primarily unemployed when he was in England. And this thing about going into the asylum, he went in 3 years after the Ripper murders took place in 1891. And I've had the opportunity to interview Richard Jones of the Jack the Ripper tour, and not only the YouTube channel, the website, and, of course, the actual tour company, Richard Jones, author of the Illustrated History of the Whitechapel Murders. And one thing that he pointed out in the interview was that the Aaron Kosminsky who went into the asylum went in there in 1891, 3 years after the Whitechapel murders stopped, or the, let's not say the Whitechapel murders, after Jack the Ripper's Autumn of Terror stopped. So the Aaron Kosminsky of 1891 might not have been the same as the Aaron Kosminsky of 1888, because the Aaron Kosminsky of 1891 wanted to eat food out of the gutter, he was afraid to take a bath, he had a phobia of bathing. So these are some things that almost would suggest that his mental state deteriorated a lot in 1891 as opposed to 1888 when the Jack the Ripper murders took place, and that he was someone who was losing control of his mental faculties much later as opposed to earlier, not to mention this thing about attacking his sister with a knife. Well, that kind of also is a little bit difficult and problematic with the Ripper theory, because what Jack the Ripper is just out of control and murdering women, viciously murdering somebody like Mary Kelly beyond recognition. And one theory is with Aaron Kosminsky that his family confined him into and they just wouldn't release him from the dwelling that he was in, and that's why he was never captured. But if that's the case, he went into the asylum for attacking his sister with a knife or threatening to attack his sister with a knife. That stuff doesn't really sit well with me, and those are some doubts that I have when it comes to Aaron Kosminsky as being Jack the Ripper. But what do you think? And if you think there's a stronger suspect than any of the ones that I've listed off, Charles Lechmere, Joseph Barnett, Jacob Levy, and Aaron Kosminsky, please put your ideas in the comments section down below. And there's something that also needs to be said. I've just told you 4 suspects that I think very highly of actually being the Ripper. I actually believe that within the top 100 most frequently discussed suspects that we can find the Ripper, whereas you guys will know from Zodiac Monday, I don't like any of the prime suspects, any of the widely discussed suspects. I'm like, no, there's just conflicting pieces of evidence, there are weak cases, there are real facts that are stitched together with a lot of imagination. But with the Ripper case, completely different story. I think that we might actually know one of the suspects who is Jack the Ripper. We just need the supporting evidence. But another odd thing about Patrick Auerbach's book is that it does not contain a suspect profile on Charles Lechmere, and I can only guess that he wrote this book or had the plan for this book before Charles Lechmere was widely discussed as a Jack the Ripper suspect, but he's definitely been one who is at the forefront of a lot of discussions on the internet. And also, the other suspects that I mentioned, Jacob Levy and Joseph Barnett, are not mentioned in the book either, but I do have to admit that they are somewhat less frequently discussed. Now, there's another suspect profile that is very short. In fact, about half a page of text is devoted to this suspect, and his name is James Kelly. I think that James Kelly is a rather intriguing suspect. I wouldn't put him in the top level, maybe somewhere in the mid-level, because I'm just going to read a segment from Patrick Auerbach's book about the Jack the Ripper suspect, James Kelly. And I have discussed him on a previous Jack the Ripper report, back when I did that segment. I've discussed him on BlackBoxOnlineRadio before, but I've not devoted a complete suspect profile episode to James Kelly. He was born in 1860 and passed away in 1929. He was a suspect in the Jack the Ripper case due to his escape from Broadmoor Asylum in early 1888, after being committed for the murder of his wife in 1883. Despite police searches for him at previous residences, Kelly was not found. He turned himself into the officials in 1927 and died 2 years later. So he escapes from the asylum, Broadmoor, and he doesn't come back voluntarily until 1927. I mean, this is just absolutely shocking. That's like nearly 40 years. What is that, 39 years? I don't know any math, so don't quote me on that. But yes, he voluntarily chose to come back to the asylum 2 years before he passed away. And that's why some people think that This guy was a convicted murderer. He was someone who escaped from a lunatic asylum, and then the Jack the Ripper murder started and the Autumn of Terror took place. And that is something that does need some strong consideration. It shows that he was a criminal deviant. He was someone who was mentally unstable, as well as possibly there was some type of nominal connection to one of the victims, Mary Kelly, James Kelly, Mary Kelly. I know that those connections are not super strong, but that's something to think about all the same. But I'm going to keep going with this here. In 1997, Jim Tully wrote a book about Kelly as a suspect, and the book is called Prisoner 117. Prisoner 1167. I know that. I know that too. I can't believe I misread that. I've talked about that book multiple times on Ripper Wednesday. Excuse me. Ed Norris, a retired New York Police Department detective, claimed in a Discovery Channel program that Kelly was Jack the Ripper and responsible for murders in the United States as well. Norris cited the fact that Kelly's Broadmoor asylum file had not been opened since his return in 1927 as evidence for his claim. Now, here's where I have to draw a hard line and give some very strong pushback. Did you hear that? The file has not been opened. Therefore, that is strong evidence that this guy was Jack the Ripper. We see this all the time in other true crime cases. Someone will say, there's a secret file that could have information that means that my suspect was the killer. Well, if it's a secret file, how do you know what's in there? If it hasn't been released, how do you know that it's going to have some type of incriminating evidence? And I will never accept this explanation of, well, the only reason why somebody would hide a file like that is because they don't want the truth getting out time and time again. I mean, I can just give you numerous examples of how that has happened in the Zodiac case, and I'll probably encounter some of them in the D.B. Cooper case as I go through the different suspects, but that is not an acceptable form of evidence, just saying that there's a secret file that proves that my suspect is guilty. So that is a challenge. But I do have some just kind of side notes to share about this story from Broadmoor. When I did the Jack the Ripper report about James Kelly, I encountered a book called Broadmoor Revealed, and this is one that I would definitely like to read in the future. I might even discuss it on the Wednesday show, although I would be very clear that I'm not presenting it as solely a Jack the Ripper case, but I had a chance to read a section of this book on Google Books, and it actually shared the story with me of Christiana Edmonds, who was a real murderer called the Chocolate Cream Killer, and ever since I've been going through the Jack the Ripper case, I've just been fascinated with these stories from the asylums, not only Broadmoor, but also Colney Hatch Asylum. And there's also a book out there called Some Notes from Colney Hatch, or some variant of that title that I would like to add to the possible reading list for the future as well, simply because these books are going to have connections to numerous true crime stories. And I'm curious what type of connections we could find, but that would have to be some type of side note episode. An interesting fact is the first time I ever discussed Broadmoor Asylum was for an old black box recording about the crime that involved Mahmoud Hussein Matan. It was the murder from Tiger Bay, which is the subject of the book The Fortune Men by Nadifa Mohammed, and that is a just case of wrongful prosecution, or a case of somebody being singled out when he wasn't actually the killer. And it's possible that the real killer ended up in Broadmoor, but that's a story for another time. And to get back to the next Jack the Ripper suspect profile, I would like to go to one that is in here in Patrick Auerbach's book, and it's Dr. Thomas Neal Cream. Now, I think that you can tell that I've talked about Dr. Thomas Cream on the channel a lot. He's a real serial killer. He was a real serial killer called the Lambeth Poisoner. He operated in Canada, the United States, and England. And I just don't really see any evidence of Thomas Cream being Jack the Ripper, because even if you take away the question of, well, where was he at the time, just looking at the fact that he is a serial killer who operated as a poisoner, and were any of Jack the Ripper's victims poisoned, doesn't matter, because they were so viciously assaulted and mutilated and murdered, cut up with knives, that is just a completely different type of MO, in my opinion. I mean, this is just a completely different type of serial killer. And if anything, it goes to show that there are a lot more serial killers operating than people thought. And this is something that I hope Black Box Online Radio can contribute to bring awareness to the fact that there are more serial killers out there than people had originally expected. And you guys who follow true crime cases closely know that. You guys know that. But in the terms of the general public, a lot of people aren't necessarily aware that these types of behaviors are much more frequent than it might initially seem. But with Dr. Thomas Neal Cream, there is a line here in the suspect profile written by Patrick Auerbach when he talks about how the reason why most people don't believe that Thomas Cream was Jack the Ripper is he is convicted for a murder in America in 1881, and that is the murder of Daniel Stott. But that's stuff that I've talked about on the channel before, and he serves 10 years in prison for that. But Dr. Thomas Cream was actually having an affair with Daniel Stott's wife, and he poisoned him with strychnine, and on Daniel Stott's tombstone, he was listed. They wrote that he was a victim of Dr. Cream and Stott's wife. She was listed as one of the accomplices. The family wanted that included on the tombstone. Terrible story, terrible story. And as I said, Dr. Cream was a real serial killer, and there are lots of books that have been written about him. But I don't believe that he was Jack the Ripper. And the next suspect that I would like to talk to you guys about is Montague John Druitt. Again, I have a standalone episode about him here on this channel. He's one of the most widely discussed suspects, and he was even included in the Melvin McNaughton Memorandum, which was written in response to an article from a publication called The Sun, which came out in 1894, and that said that the Sun said that they had found Jack the Ripper, and his name was Thomas Cutbush, and Melvin McNaughton, who was an inspector, not exactly on the Ripper case, but perhaps the year after, however, he still had access to the files, responded by listing 3 suspects whom he believed were more likely to be Jack the Ripper than Thomas Cutbush, and he said Aaron Kosminsky and Michael Ostrog and Montague John Druitt. Now, as I said, Aaron Kosminsky is a reasonable suspect. Michael Ostrog, absolutely not. He was most likely incarcerated in France at the time, and there's a segment about him in Patrick Auerbach's book as well, but that's just an open and shut, more or less, dismissal. But I'm going to read the introductory statement about Montague John Druitt. Montague John Druitt was born on the 15th of August in 1857, and he died in December of 1888. Sometime in early December, we are unsure. He was an English barrister and educator who was suspected of being involved with the Jack the Ripper murders. He came from an upper middle class English background and attended Winchester College and the University of Oxford. After graduation, he worked as an assistant schoolmaster at a boarding school and pursued a career in law, qualifying as a barrister in 1885. Druitt's primary extracurricular activity was cricket, which he played with prominent players like Lord Harris and Francis Lacey. I know nothing about cricket. I have no idea who those people are, but I digress from that. Now, if you were to Google Montague John Druitt, it would appear that they'll list his occupation as a school teacher. Sometimes they'll say that he was a lawyer. Melville McNaughton even referred to him as a doctor. But it's my understanding that he primarily worked as a barrister, and he had a part-time job at a school. And one of the reasons why he died is some people think that he committed suicide because he was terminated from the school. He really liked working there, but he may have actually been outed as a homosexual, and that's a little bit speculative. I'm not 100% certain of that, but that is a theory that people have, and that he committed suicide because he was just embarrassed, he was disgraced, and it was not something that was publicly acceptable at the time. So as far as his involvement in the Ripper case, there are some things that have been put forward here. These would include the challenges that I'll read right here from Patrick Auerbach's book. Other Ripper authors have criticized Montague John Druitt as a suspect and the theories, arguing that they are based on flawed circumstantial evidence and attempting to provide Druitt with alibis for the times of the murders. On the day of Annie Chapman's murder, for example, Druitt played cricket in Blackheath, and on the other day, after the murders of Stride and Eddowes, he was in the West Country defending a client in court. And this is where I have to stop. Now, it's just because he is in one place the next day, or one place earlier in the day, that doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't do it. And that actually is one thing that's included here in the book. The next sentence is saying, well, I mean, he would have had opportunity to travel between London and the engagements. Others dismiss this as improbable. You have to do a lot more to rule out a suspect than, say, Well, he was in a different city during the afternoon, and the crime occurred after midnight in London. I mean, it's very possible that he could have come back and committed the murders. I don't think very highly of Montague John Druitt as a suspect. I think that he was completely out of line when it comes to the psychological profiling. It's just that I don't think that he should be eliminated for those reasons alone. And those are not solid alibis. That someone's in a different part of England during the morning and then they end up and back in London the next day. I really am just not very convinced by that. But what do you think about Montague John Druitt as a suspect? But as I said, this book does have a conclusion about Jack the Ripper, and this conclusion has a set of challenge questions for the reader. And you guys know, on Black Box Online Radio, I love challenge questions. So, the first challenge question is, as we come to the end of this book, we must ask ourselves, what is the legacy of Jack the Ripper? Well, the legacy is that a series of brutal and vicious homicides took place, and the killer got away. No matter who Jack the Ripper was, no matter if it was one person or a group of people or some type of royal conspiracy, the killer or killers got away. Somebody got away with this. That's the legacy. The next question. Why, over a century later, are we still fascinated by the elusive killer who terrorized the streets of Whitechapel? And I'm going to attempt to answer this one. Because, as I said, not only talking about the Ripper, but also the Zodiac, D.B. Cooper, and other unsolved mysteries, the Phantom Killer, the New Orleans Axeman. With Jack the Ripper, I believe part of it is the simplicity of the case. Now, some people might not think that Jack the Ripper was a simple murder mystery. However, there are only 5 confirmed victims, and I'm sure you know their names. Even with the unconfirmed victims, you probably know them too. It's a story that people do not have to put a lot of time in before they can learn a lot of the people in it. And there's also this problem-solving element where people can analyze certain aspects of the case, and they can give their own interpretations of the evidence. Enough evidence has been made available where people can make their own judgments. I think that factors into it. Now, some people are going to talk about morbid curiosity. Yes, absolutely, there's morbid curiosity. Other people are going to talk about sympathy and empathy for the victims, having the type of emotional response to what happened to the women who were attacked by Jack the Ripper. Yes, absolutely, there's that too. And then just the overall aspect of analyzing facts. People are fascinated by things like forensics. In the 1888 forensics were not very advanced, but people are still curious about them all the same. But I do think there is something about the simplicity of this case, whereas we have serial killers who commit way more murders than Jack the Ripper, and nobody even wants to know what happened with them. Sometimes the mainstream media won't even talk about them. And it's not just simply because a serial killer was vicious and they did bad things. It's also because a persona was created. And the name Jack the Ripper is used on letters, and there are also letters that have been attributed to the killer, and people still debate about their authenticity to this day. So you have the persona, you have the simplicity, and then you have the morbid curiosity and the empathy and sympathy for the victims. All of that is why people are curious about Jack the Ripper. That's my response, but I would love to know your responses to these questions. What is the legacy of Jack the Ripper, and why over a century later are we still fascinated by the elusive killer? And you can share anything you want in the comment section down below. I would love to read them. But I'll just give Patrick Auerbach a little bit more of a send-off, his attempt to answer the first question about the legacy. The legacy of Jack the Ripper also speaks to our enduring fascination with true crime. From the sensational newspaper coverage of the time to countless books, movies, and TV shows that have followed, the Ripper has captured our imagination in ways that few other crimes have. Yes, absolutely. That thing about what I said about simplicity and people giving their own interpretations of the evidence, capturing the imagination, that's even a more lighthearted way of looking at it. I was thinking more about the technical aspects of it. He's talking more about the abstract aspects of it, but that's why we do things like book discussions here on Black Box Online Radio so we can compare and contrast ideas. But what is your response to any of those questions? What do you think about any of the suspects that have been discussed? And I just want to point out that there are other suspects that are mentioned in Patrick Auerbach's book, and I think you can tell from the way I'm talking, I definitely appreciated his Jack the Ripper sections more than the Zodiac Killer sections. And finally, the title of the book, once more, is Unsolved Murders, the Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper by Patrick Auerbach. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com, and that's all from me now. Until next time.